welcome to the show. I appreciate you coming on, man.
I appreciate you having me, bro. I'm excited for our conversation. We connected the other day on the phone, and I think there was a ton of shared interest, shared energy. Obviously, we discussed kind of the more esoteric, the synchronicity. So I think there's a lot of alignment here, and I'm excited to see what today turns into.
Yeah, man. I want to start by saying thank you for what you put out, the message that you send via your podcast, your website, your socials. I think it's inspiring to me because it's in many ways what I hope to send as well. I think, like you mentioned, there's a lot of alignment. And I also think we need a lot more people sending whatever their message is, as long as it's authentic. It doesn't have to be exactly in alignment with yours or mine, but I think that we need more people that do that, and I think you're doing that, and I appreciate it. And I also want to thank you for the time that you put into it, because it's high quality stuff.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It's kind of somewhat surreal to hear that sort of feedback, as I'm very much in the arena, as I say, alongside you and on the front end of my kind of quote unquote creator journey, just like yourself. So it is very weird to start hearing that kind of feedback. It's very kind of self-assuring, but I also would kind of echo back that it speaks to your open-mindedness and potentially character as well, that you take that as a green light as opposed to a red light. I think a lot of people could say and are easily deferred from entering any kind of space, but especially entrepreneurship, at the illusion of saturation. Oh, he's already doing it, or there's already so many people in that space. You mean another podcast, another self-development guy? Like, who do you think you are, the guru? Like, you've probably heard literally all of that and more, as I did when I was entering the space over a year and a half ago. But the proof is in the pudding, right? Like, I entered at that point when people were saying don't do it, and here I am still going. You're entering somewhere down the line, and you're finding success, and you will continue to find success as long as you stay consistent with it. Someone could start today. This could be the impetus for anyone. You could come to this podcast in 2 years, and it's probably still in like infinitely saturable space, both for good and bad reasons, but the world is extremely abundant. I choose to assume that as my perspective and frame, and I have yet to have that disproved, and I think the longer you hold that belief and intention, the more the world will reflect it back towards you.
Entirely agree, man. And I want to get into the impetus of your journey. Like I mentioned, I start all the podcasts the same. I want to get as good of a background picture as I can about you. You can be as vague as you'd like, or as detailed as you'd like, but how'd you get from where you were to where you are now, where you were being childhood, wherever you want to start?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it relatively concise and give you a few branches that might be interesting to follow into. But I've had to tell the origin story, so I think it's important to get better and better at that skill, to let people feel seen and heard through theirs. So I, for as long as I can remember, was very fascinated in the world of self-mastery, self-development. For me, it started as a way to transcend insecurities when I was just a little kid. I grew up playing team sports my entire life. When I was little, it was like basketball and soccer, and then eventually into lacrosse all the way through university. But I was always kind of a chubbier kid, so I could compete with the kids when I was playing, like talent-wise, coordination, but I just didn't look the part of the athlete. I wasn't secure enough to take my shirt off in the locker room. So it started very simply and very externally by, Google searching how to get abs on YouTube, and then from there, it goes into like training, and then training to nutrition, and nutrition to metabolism and cellular biology and all these things. And I clung early on in my journey to my intellect, and I used that as my shield before the kind of physique caught up to match, I suppose, or was another thing that I could be secure in or confident in. And so along that journey, it was a very intellectual pursuit. I loved reading as a child, studying the great men of history, as well as the modern great figures, Steve Jobs being one in modernity that's very inspiring to myself, but even the conquerors of old, Alexander, Napoleon, etc. And so that was always kind of a part of my life. But again, it was very intellectual, and it was internally driven. I wasn't like putting things into the world. I didn't start making content, writing, sharing. I was just kind of a normal kid. Although I suppose in retrospect, relatively uncommon. And then into university, kind of forced to make that decision on what do you study? What's your future going to look like? And I struggled making that decision because similar, and this will lead into kind of what I've built with the Vitruvian, but I never felt like I fit into one specific specialty or box. You know, I could write an essay just as well as I could do calculus and physics. And so it made it hard to choose at university, like the major, and especially if it was like, you know, the smart kids go into engineering. So they were like pushing me, and that's eventually what I ended up doing. I went to a very, you know, like prestigious and high caliber engineering school and studied biomedical engineering and did the thing to like kind of flex the big brain. But I also like felt like I was a little bit of abandoning myself. And so it's been awesome to now stepping into what I'm doing now, get to have that full balanced expression of self and not have to silo myself, which I think that is another one of those like false binaries or false gates that we have to step through in society. People want you to be siloed into one thing. Like you are an ER word, you're a teacher, lawyer, you're one thing that people can easily label you. And I don't think that the human spirit fits well into a single label. And so what's awesome about the work that I do now is that I get to kind of pursue my interests at the entire breadth of my curiosity and follow it wherever it goes, whether that be the training and nutrition and the really technical stuff, or the kind of more artistic pursuits and philosophy. And then entrepreneurship is kind of that next evolution where you're in what is the modern day version of conquering, combat, growing. It is like the best arena to step into that we have remaining, I think, for the quote unquote conqueror types, or the people that feel like they need to overcome the world or in some sense themselves. And so the Vitruvian was born out of all of that, wanting to make something to help people. And I really had no idea what it was going to look like. Doing a lot of internal work during my last year of university, just exploring kind of what are my interests, background, passions, unique skill sets, maybe weaknesses as well. A lot of exercises that I actually ended up incorporating into the program that I work with my guys on now. And a lot of that was just like unconscious and subconscious work where, you know, I was spending time journaling, asking myself these questions, writing the answers out, but it was never like an aha moment. I wasn't visited in a dream by an angel that said like, hey, you're going to make this thing and be called the Vitruvian. But in retrospect, it is funny how it does feel like it was a divinely ordained path, because upon graduation, I took a position full-time at a med device startup aligned with kind of the major that I studied, but in parallel, also made a pretty big investment into a kind of mastermind that showed you how to make an online business. And during the process of going through their curriculum, the mentors in that program were kind of like, okay, what will you call it? What is your niche? Again, another one of those like encouragements in entrepreneurship that way I think types like myself that aren't well defined into one bucket can struggle with, which is like niching down. It makes it much clearer to your audience members, to the quote unquote market, when you are very specific. You know, I help X do X by X. You know, you see a ton of those bios on Twitter, and it's very effective for monetization, but I also intuitively felt like that wasn't me, and it wasn't going to be something that allowed me to spread my arms and not feel any walls. So I exposed that advice by creating the Vitruvian, which is a balanced 12-week self-mastery program where it's not just one or the other component of what I could do. You know, I could do fitness training. I know a tremendous amount about training, nutrition, metabolism, all that kind of stuff. But that's not my thing to give. There are people who are better at just that, and they also don't have all these other things that make me up. And so I created the Vitruvian as its namesake comes from that famous Leonardo da Vinci sketch, the Vitruvian Man, the circle and the square. So the idea being that at the center of self-mastery, you take domain and control over your body. But like Leonardo himself, the idea of a Renaissance man, we have the capacity to be so much. And I think that capacity calls forth the duty to do so, to kind of harness the most of which you're capable in all domains. So across the 12 weeks, you're kind of working on 3, what I call the Vitruvian identities, which are warrior, philosopher, and artist. Warrior being that body, being the physical systems that you have, your routines, your systems, etc. Philosopher, that mindset side. What is your philosophy of self? What are the beliefs that you hold? Why do you hold those beliefs? What are some limiting beliefs that maybe were programmed into you that you need to unlearn? And then that final aspect, the artist. I believe that the human spirit, every person here has some gift to give the world. And that creative expression can take many and arguably infinite forms, but figuring out what is your thing to give, whether it be just coaching the high school kids at your local high school or really building out your own personal brand and starting a podcast or whatever it may be, finding that advantage within yourself and arming yourself with the confidence that like, I'm here to do this thing. I have a purpose and I now can point to it and say that this is my thing and this is my heroic mission and here's what I'm going to work on. So long-winded, but that's where I am today, and it's what's brought us together.
I like how you ended on the arm stretch, sort of an homage to the Vitruvian.
Yeah, a little bit. You're a little quiet on your end. Could you turn up?
Yeah, my bad. Let's see. How about that?
If you can keep going up.
How about that?
Money. Okay, much better.
Cool. Good deal. Yeah, dude, a lot to unpack there. Thank you for the detail. Sometimes it's not right or wrong. Sometimes just people are very brief. I think that speaks to your level of introspection on your end. The first thing I want to touch on is the athlete journey, man. I think we spoke about this as well prior to this. I played collegiate sports as well, same conference. I know several friends of mine that actually played sports at your school as well. But the athlete journey, to me, at least people that take it that step after athletics, whatever it is, it always seems to have stemmed from some level of, of seeking for an advantage within the athletics. And for me, it's interesting to hear you talk about the chubbiness, because that's something that I was always, like yourself, athletic. I was, you threw me in a sport, give me a week, I was going to be good at it and people would know. But I never felt super comfortable in my body. I was always, like, when I remember one time, like a 5th grade field trip, we went to the pool and I like didn't take my shirt off. And now that you mentioned that, I don't know if I've thought about that since, but I remember being like, I didn't take my shirt off. Why didn't I do that? But I always felt like I was not superior athletically, but like I was a high level athlete, but I didn't really feel like it in my body, if that makes sense. And that translates to my athletic career as well in college, when I was always trying to I was doing introspection for the athletic purpose, if that makes sense. Like I was looking into myself to see how I could become the best baseball player I could. Okay, well, my focus isn't as strong as it needs to be, or my attention span's not as strong as I would like it to be. What can I do to allow that to be implemented into my baseball game? My body, my movement, the mobility of my hips isn't where it needs to be. What little tiny things can I do to do that? Then it gets into diet. And like you said, then it starts talking about metabolism, cellular biology, and so on and so forth. But I think it's interesting. I've spoken to several people on this podcast already that was the impetus for them. Somewhere along their athletic journey, it sort of tied everything in and allowed them to start focusing on themselves as the project, if that makes sense, which I find fascinating. And the other thing that you mentioned, which I heard you speak on in the Noah Ryan episode, the niching down, that's something that I relate to heavily. And for a long, long time, I viewed it as a negative in myself. I was like, I could do this, but I don't want to focus only on that. I feel like that would kill me inside. Or I could do this, but I don't want to focus only on that, because that would just take away from all these other things that I'm interested in. And it wasn't until I started the podcast, and to reference something else that was mentioned in the Noah Ryan podcast, is the umbrella, like finding something that allows you the ability to explore those interests, like you mentioned, which is what you're doing now. That's one of the most gratifying things for me, having started the podcast in Tyro, is it is that umbrella for me. I can talk to whoever I want to talk to. I can listen to whoever I want to listen to. I can have conversations with people that have interests in jiu-jitsu, then talk to somebody that likes cellular biology, then talk to a holistic doctor, then talk to somebody who hunts, and then so on and so forth. And I don't know if it's selfish, perhaps relating to the last part that you just mentioned, the artist, like what can you give to the world? To me, it feels selfish almost, because I'm like, well, this is what I want to talk about. This is what I want to do, so I'm going to do it. But perhaps in that is the permission for somebody else to do the same. And this harkens back to a quote that my buddy Will on episode 13 mentioned. I'm going to butcher it, but the quote goes, "Do not do what the world needs more. Or, don't give to the world what it needs more of. Give to the world what makes you feel alive, because the world needs more people that are alive. And in my opinion, it sounds like you're very much so alive in your fight and in your battle, which I think is really, really cool.
Yeah, I appreciate all of that, and I would like to address kind of three main things from that in the reverse order that you shared them. So first, touching on that immediately, I think that is another one of those things that is an illusion. It is like it's a false door, or maybe kind of as Don Miguel Ruiz calls it, like an agreement. It's a rule that somebody else made that we can unconsciously fall victim to, which is that it is a selfish pursuit to share something that is deeply meaningful to yourself, or to even dive in and do the internal work, right? Like, people will shame or project or berate or even abandon you when you start to do that internal work. Like, what do you mean you can't come out? Oh, you think you're better than us? Like, what are you eating, bro? Like, that must be like big gym guy now, huh? Like, oh, you're reading? Like, come on, it's just one night. Like, all this kind of feedback. And sometimes it can get much more than just passive. A lot of times that's just, cheeky banter with the lads, but sometimes it's like, it's very toxic, and you have to, cut those people out of your life, because when you take that internal journey, it can be very, very, very isolating for that reason, because it shows that other people, or reminds them in themselves, that they're not maybe actualizing the most of what they're capable. I talked in my last episode that I'm about to release with Fury from Twitter about altruism, and the only true altruism, in my opinion, and we discussed this topic, is selfishness, because you can only pour from a cup that is overflowing. It is only in the excess of self that you can give to someone else and continue to give that pursuit. I think as men, because we are providers and protectors, there is a temptation to fall into self-abandoning practices. Like, I'm going to go to this job that I hate, work unbelievable hours just to give to my family. And you'll do it day in and day out because of that love, because of that masculine imperative. But I suppose, mistake is that after some amount of time, your cup runs dry. And then all of that, eventually that cup, it demands to be filled, and you start pulling from the people that you love most, and it ends up hurting them more. So there's my currently pinned tweet is a quote from the Fountainhead, Ayn Rand, and I can't remember the character at the time that's saying it, but it's, to say I love you, one must know the I. And it kind of expounds on that, saying that, like, the love of someone who doesn't know themselves is a parasite, and the love of a parasite is meaningless. And so under that, I was saying, like, selfishness as selflessness. So I would say that, yeah, doing exactly what you're doing is the highest form of altruism that you are capable of, because it will bring abundance to you. Like the physical pursuit, like taking the 1 or 2 hours to train, eat correctly, get to bed on time, all of that stuff gives you the abundant energy to then pour into the people that are around you. It carries even very energetically, like the smile that you give to the people that you interact with in even a transaction, all the way into like romantic relationships, being a father eventually. All of these things have to stem from the self, and it is like the nature of the Vitruvian, like the slogan of the company is "Be the Renaissance." Like if you want to see some sort of massive movement in the world, you have to embody the change that you want to see. There's no sign-up sheet coming. There's no like, yep, I support the cause. Like we are all part of this thing. Like that is not it. Like it is an internal journey. And I have kind of a very Jungian perspective in that sense. Like the purpose of life is the self-actualization. And then in the pursuit of self, the world around you becomes infinitely more abundant. But we can go down more of that later. The second thing was...
the umbrella niching.
Yeah, like the niching and the umbrella kind of addressed in that.
The athletic journey.
The first thing was the athletic journey, and then there was a middle one.
Umbrella. This is the problem with a hunter type.
I know.
I have no idea. Athletic journey, niching down, umbrella, giving to the world. Can't quite remember.
It's
if
okay.
it comes back to you, interject
no,
whenever.
You're good. We can cut that out, so I don't look incompetent, but
no, dude, you're fine. You just mentioned it briefly. I would actually like to read the Vitruvian Manifesto and get your thoughts on it, because I think it's phenomenal. It goes,
yeah, absolutely.
You are the Renaissance. There will be no grand crusade to join, no mass demonstration. The movement is not collective. You are the movement. You are the dreamer and the dream, the creator and his creation, the artist and his masterpiece. Your noble cause is your self-discovery. Your great war is within. The world's people are losing themselves. They are directionless, numb, passive, and afraid. They are content with small dreams and defend the status quo. Their misery seeks company. Do not join them. In a world that is lost, find purpose. In a world of degeneracy, lead with virtue. In a world of specialization, study everything. In a world of ordinary, be uncommon. In a world of decline, be the Renaissance. And firstly, that's so well written, man. Like, that is incredible. I think every person should read that. But I want to get your take on what that means to you.
Man, it's surreal. You're the first person to read it back to me, and it's not just myself reading it. So thank you for that moment. It's definitely a moment of surrealism, and I'm filled with a bit of joy and pride. I spoke at length for anyone who's curious about kind of the construction of it on episode 44 of my podcast when I discussed kind of the future direction of the company and the brand and everything. But I definitely want to go into some of that here. So I think that it's important in general to have clarity of direction. And I look at this company and what I'm building here as an extension of myself, rather than something that I'm trying to build for the goal of an exit or the goal of acquisition and scaling and all these things, which I think are great. And again, I'm in the arena of entrepreneurship. I aspire to help scale and build really, really big and meaningful brands in the world. But everything that the Vitruvian is, I am as well. And like I kind of spoke on the slogan before you read the manifesto, being the Renaissance, it is all encapsulated in these kind of fractals or microcosms where like my pursuit of self-mastery has now bled into helping others pursue it through whether it's the client work that I do, whether it's the community I'm building, whether it's the free content on Twitter, Instagram, the podcast. All of these different kind of branches are and stem from me. And I'm pouring from an overflowing cup because of years and years and years of work, developing systems, figuring out what I do and do not want, and every single day returning to the things that fill my cup: training, nutrition, proper sleep, mindfulness practices, writing, et cetera, et cetera. But as far as the manifesto, I've always taken inspiration from both the great men of history, but also kind of these great works. And so when I was writing that, or endeavoring to write it, there were a few specific pieces of writing that I took inspiration from, or were kind of looking to be inspired by and hopefully draw from, because I think that I'm on the front end of my writer journey, communicator journey, and there are people far more eloquent than I am. So a few things that had really spoken to me over my entire life that I incorporated or had basically open on tabs for like 2 or 3 weeks as I was kind of drafting and throwing drafts away, were 1, the Holstein Manifesto, 2, the Man in the Arena speech, which is kind of my intro and outro to my podcast, the Think Different ad from Apple. And I don't know if you're familiar with Riva Tez, but there was kind of a documentary about the Praxis Project, and it's like a 20-minute kind of video essay that is from her speech, but moments about kind of pieces of writing that were extremely inspirational to myself, and I felt like encapsulated the energy that I was trying to replicate. So I spend a lot of time digesting, rereading, rehearing those things. And again, in the podcast, I kind of go into what specifically spoke to me about those things and how I was writing it. And like kind of maybe a line by line breakdown, but those were some of the things that I drew from. And when I was trying to create it, I wanted to create something that was really transcendent, like you said, something that I imagined anyone could find one day and hopefully like pin up on their wall. Like the Think Different ad, like if you have a poster of that in your room, like could you have a poster of the Vitruvian Manifesto? Could this be some sort of transcendent piece? Like that was the thing that I imagined too. And I think as a quote unquote artist or really anyone in the creative space, the goal should be to create something beautiful regardless that could stand on its own that I was proud of in a vacuum before I shared it. And I think that because I held true to that and I made sure that it was something that I was proud of before it was released, before I had the external affirmations, I could make the safe bet that it would connect with other people, because I don't think that I am particularly unique. And whatever I was tapping into to kind of synthesize that feeling, that emotion, that connection, I think that we all have the ability to tap into that same energy. And it is in that collective consciousness, the collective intelligence, the collective human experience that somebody else would find it meaningful. And if it was just one person, if it's just you and my story's cut short and I don't get to continue to build my platform, like, you can incorporate that into your life, like little pieces of inspiration. And because of the digital medium, as long as the internet is around, like, there is now going to be 50 episodes of me doing the work that I did, just in the ether, providing value to people. It's why I can feel proud, and judging by the razor of memento mori, like, if my time were called, I am proud of what I've given. I hope that God keeps me in the arena as long as possible so that I can continue to do more of it. It's very fulfilling for myself. And I think that I have a lot of good to do for the world over my life. But yeah, I know that was a bit wandering.
No, we spoke about this as well, the spoken word. And to reference Don Miguel Ruiz, which I'm assuming you've read the Four Agreements, he refers to the first agreement as be impeccable with your word. And he refers to our words as magic, and he goes into all sorts of how gossiping is black magic and all this stuff, and you're really just casting spells on yourself. But we spoke about the power of the spoken word, and how sometimes even like your name, for example, the Vitruvian, how you said it kind of was an ordained thing. It wasn't like you had this light bulb moment where, like, oh, this angel came to me, I'm going to name it this. It sounds to me that that's a very similar thing that happened with the manifesto. And perhaps now that I said it out loud, maybe that's a commonality between all original thought or original word. Maybe it's not really original. Maybe it's kind of like this same ordained, divine, like God is speaking into your life, and then you kind of just manifest that as the vessel, which I think is so cool. I think that's a profound. I would absolutely have a poster of that. I don't have any posters, but if I were, I would definitely have that as a poster. I wanted to mention this. One of my good friends, entirely in isolation. I had not mentioned that we spoke at all. He doesn't know who you are, not as like a shot, but he texted me less than 2 hours after our phone call last week and said, "Dude, new goal. Be the new aged Renaissance man." And I literally was like, dude, you have no idea the synchronicity that I actually put my phone down for a second. I was like, there's no way. Like, did he just tap into our conversation? Because within 2 hours of me speaking to you about these very same subjects, he, in complete isolation, says, my new goal is to be the new age Renaissance man. And I almost sent him your manifesto. I should have, but it's synchronicities like that. And sort of the one that I deemed our call last week, I deemed that as a synchronicity, and us getting connected as a synchronicity. It's synchronicities like that really, they're green lights to reference Matthew McConaughey. It's like, okay, keep going. Like, okay, good, here you go, keep going. So more power to you, man.
No, I agree. And it's funny. It feels weird knowing how much I have changed in just the brief kind of last 2 years, stepping into this journey. Hearing that, playing devil's advocate for the audience member, like, okay, dude, like, you were the one who wrote it, like, there's nothing else going on. But truly, like, I don't claim it like as ownership. Like, it feels like it was given to me to share with the world. And to touch on kind of what you're referring to with like your friend somewhat arbitrarily connecting and saying this idea, and then we're also seeing the rise of this like trad movement, and there's a lot of like Greek aesthetics, and all of these things are coming, right? Like it's coming into the zeitgeist, it's coming back into vogue, I suppose. The point is, like, it is time in history for these ideas to be shared. If I had them come to my head and I didn't, that's fine, but somebody else would get that idea. I think Rick Rubin talked about this on the Joe Rogan podcast. Like, there's a reason that multiple people at the same kind of time will have these ideas in isolation. Like for instance, calculus, I think it was Einstein and Leibniz that discovered it independent of one another at the exact same time in history. It was time for the calculus to enter the consciousness of man at that time, or be rediscovered. We don't know about, revisionist history and all that stuff. But as far as the timelines that we're told, like it was time for calculus to enter the world. And if one of them hadn't gotten it, or if neither of them had gotten it, it would be the next great thinker. And so I think that it is time for these ideas to be maybe not given for the first time, but remembered. And I think what's awesome about even the word Renaissance itself, it means rebirth. I think that the human story in a lot of ways is a story of rebirth. There's kind of the parallel symbolism in the story of Christ, like death and rebirth. It was Jung who said that was a metaphor for the story of self-actualization. Like you have to die to yourself to be reborn into like higher levels of consciousness.
He who loses his life shall gain it.
Exactly. And there's so many of those different quotes and so many different stories that reference it, that to me that is pointing to some sort of really true underlying truth with a capital T. And as far as, what I'm doing here, like I didn't make these words up. I'm co-opting imagery and language from great thinkers of the past. I will never claim to be some sort of like prophet, guru, like new thinker. I literally, and it's why it's part of the intro, I say this to the guys that are like, why should I work with you? Like what's the point of even connecting with you? Like what's so special about you? I'm not going to claim anything other than I'm a man in the arena trying to figure it out as well. Like I every single fucking day, like I'm trying to figure this life thing out and get the most out of myself and give back to the world when I have that abundance. And I think that anyone that purports anything differently, you should be extremely wary of, because those are the types of people that tend to be very abusive. And it's a fine line to ride when you're in the space of selling a product because you want to have, established authority. But there's something within me that doesn't want to be disingenuous or inauthentic and kind of like purport to be an expert or the authority on anything. There is only one authority. Like there is truth with a capital T. That is the only thing that is absolute. And then all of us are shades of that. And I'm going to try my best to align with what is really going on, what is the actual truth, fight for quote unquote the good guys as I see them. But I lay no claim to like any of the stuff. I'm just the vessel.
That is another remarkable synchronicity. Today in the hallway I was thinking about Tyro and what it means and how it relates to the word expert, because I was thinking people will work 10,000 hours to become an expert. And then it's like, then what? Right? Like, okay, cool. You read, like, what does it even mean that you're an expert? Like that is literally fugazi. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a word that somebody attached to a certain perception of someone. There's no it's not a physical mountain that you reach the top of. You don't climb the mountain of expertise. And the reason I thought of that is because for so long, I was like, dude, I need to become an expert in something. Like, what can it was baseball for a while. And I was like, wait, this isn't really fulfilling me. And I'm sure it'll change at some point. But Tyro, how it relates to Tyro is I want to be a Tyro for the rest of my life. I want to be a novice. I want to be a young soldier. I want to be a beginner in something. It might mean that I reach a certain level of knowledge, awareness, understanding. But I don't know if it's the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's like the essentially like when you realize that you know something, you actually realize you know nothing. Or Socrates said, I know nothing, basically. It reminds me of a quote by my jiu-jitsu coach who said when he got his black belt, his coach was like, welcome to jiu-jitsu. And for somebody that's like uninitiated, it's like, what do you mean, dude? You've been doing this for 10 years. Like, what do you mean, welcome to jiu-jitsu? It's because every window that opens, there's another gate to reference that. Like there's another, what's the word? Like vortex to be entered into of like infinite possibilities. So to hear you say that about expertise is interesting because that's something that I've thought about a lot. And I think that it's a trap that people fall into much too often, because then once you get, me and my brother call each other idiots all the time on purpose. Like we got it from Joe Rogan because he always refers to himself as a moron. And most people are like, wait, dude, you're a 100 millionaire. You are arguably one of the most influential people in the world on planet Earth. You have all these interests that you're like expert at. How can you call yourself a moron? And to me, it's a compliment. Like, I never want to be the smartest person in the room. I never want to be the most intellectual. I never want to be the best at X, Y, or Z, because if I envision myself at that point, I feel that I will lose the zest and the drive to continue filling my cup, if that makes sense. It's almost as if, to harken back to that analogy, like once you think that you've reached that expert level, that cup starts going this way. It's like if you think you've reached that level, it's only this way. You can't keep going. So that's an interesting insight and parallel between a thought that I had today and what you just said.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was Aristotle or Socrates or something that's like, the more that you know, the more that you realize you don't know, or like the true philosopher realizes how much he does not know, something to that effect. And yeah, no, I mean, it's like a great way to tell not only someone's character, because I think there is like a ego diminishing kind of aspect of it, admitting how much you don't know or admitting how much of a novice you are in really any arena or just the arena of the life experience. But it's a great way to judge who's really about it and who's really on the path of just continual improvement. And it's funny with the concept of Tyro continuing to hold on to that white belt mentality, that student mentality, always being open to learn from the environment. When I set out on my entrepreneurial journey, and I talked about this on the podcast when I was quitting my full-time job and really diving in, burning the boats. I think it was episode 29. But people can look back for burning the boats if they want to listen. I had this kind of, again, another one of these like synchronicities, one of these weird moments, where I always wear like a pendant chain I have since high school. Back in the day, it was like a cross. And then for a while it was this serenity prayer, which kind of like aligned with some of the Stoic ideals of like control the controllables, ignore the rest. But that got basically snatched and broken off in a lacrosse game that I was playing. And so I was like looking for the next pendant I was going to use, whatever. Kind of a very stupid thing to kind of have to solve. But in parallel to like that position in my life, I came across through like a YouTube video, somebody talking about the symbols in the tarot deck and how they're kind of like a metaphor for life. And I don't know how much you're familiar with tarot, but basically the Joker or the Jack the tarot tells the story of the Joker. And if you look up, for anyone listening, if you look that up, the actual card itself, it's basically like his arms are outstretched and he's looking up towards the sky optimistically, but he's standing at the edge of a cliff, like ready to kind of walk off wistfully. And the card, when you draw it, allegedly with tarot, is like it's supposed to be good luck for entrepreneurship. And so that's the pendant I have on now. Very and cool. I kind of like set the intention when I put it on to maintain that delusional optimism throughout my entrepreneurial journey. Like always expect the best of the world, only keep your eyes towards the highest outcome, regardless of the fears, the dangers, the risks, all of these things. And for those listening, I'm throwing up the air quotes, that people are going to tell you, like, are you sure? Is it going to work out? All of these things, like, again, risk, even the word is kind of interesting. Like it's just it's an illusion because it's how you choose to define it. Like to some people, leveraging capital for an investment is risky, but the upside could also be extremely high. To me, when I look at what can I get more of and what can I not get more of, money versus time, it's a clear decision for myself. Like money is just like there's theoretically an infinite ceiling. You can just keep getting more of it, whether it's through gritting your teeth and doing some sort of like very manual job to make ends meet, or finding yourself in a very highly leveraged position through media or through whatever it may be, like building up an expertise in some sort of kind of information field. There's always more money to get, but you're never going to be 24 again, and you're never going to be that kid again that could take a trip across the world and really just lean into your intuition and take what many people will tell you is a risk. But again, the risk is you don't make that decision and then you never have the choice to make it back. Like you can earn a couple grand back later. You can earn all of your life savings back later. I don't know how much you listen to like Hormozy, but the dude is a total philosopher because of his life experience. And he just had a second episode on Chris Willicks's podcast. And it's like, he was talking about how he had scaled up his gym business to whatever it was, had this big exit, and then he got screwed over by a gym partner who literally like embezzled the money to a Swiss bank account, and he had no recourse. He lost all of his life's earnings the last 5 years. And to many people, that's like a total failure. But he was talking about how the entrepreneurial journey and life in general, it's who you're becoming along the way. And then in the next 12 months, he made back, it was something like 10x the amount he made in the last 5 years because of the skills he had acquired, because of the experiences he had acquired, which again, the money, perfect example. And use his story because I don't have the like road work to point to directly, at least on the financial side. Like, take it from somebody who's further down the entrepreneurial journey, building $100 million companies. It's just crazy. I don't know. To me, it's like the binary is so clear. I've had so many painful examples in like family members' lives and people close to me that like you can take the safe route all the way to the end and still get fucked. So to me, it's like you have to lean into exactly what you want out of this life, and you will always figure it out. The dots always connect in retrospect. So don't stress about trying to make them connect in prospect or into the future.
Firstly, less than an hour ago, I was listening to that podcast while I was eating lunch. So I love their dynamic. I think they're both fascinating individuals. And I think for some reason, their conversational style lends really well to one another. And they have just remarkably insightful conversations. And there's some things I want to touch on that actually now that you brought it up later. But the money versus time thing, are you familiar with Naval Ravikant?
Yep.
So he has a quote, I'm going to paraphrase again. People spend time trying to save money when they should be spending money trying to save time for the exact reason that you just mentioned. One is infinite, theoretically. One is not. One is the most finite thing that we have, right? So to me, like you mentioned, it's extraordinarily clear to me. I spoke on this recently. I've already crossed that threshold. Like it might be very difficult for some people. It took me a while, honestly, like to conceptualize. But like regarding health or the expense, the investment of health up front, I will spend more money on my health now so that I don't have to later. So that I can hopefully, God willing, have more time and more vitality, more energy, more focus down the line. So it's really, I think it's just a threshold that people have to cross. And I think it's very, very important because like you mentioned, theoretically, you could spend all the time you possibly have trying to save money and then still get fucked. So it's like,
yeah. And I wish I'm still trying to navigate how to share this story. So I'm unfortunately going to have to leave an unclosed thought loop here, but I will just say that like in my personal family's life, and it's a story, again, I want to share because it heavily informs how I see the world and why I see the world the way it is. But you can take the safe route. You can follow the traditional path. You can put all the money in the savings accounts. You can spend countless hours at a corporate job, saving high percentage stuff, not taking vacations, driving old cars, having an unrefurbished house, like making every quote unquote right decision, and the floor can still get ripped out from under you in like the most soap opera tragic way possible. And maybe it wouldn't be that way, right? Like there's not a guarantee, but when we look at the regrets of the dying on the most consistent basis, like it helps, in my opinion, to take, Hormozy talks about it, like the frame of the veteran, like project yourself out to your 85-year-old self. And if that's hard for you, just listen to people who make it that far. Like look up online, the regrets of the dying. It is literally never, I wish I had spent more time at my office, saving a little bit more, or, deferring my excitement and experience and whatever. Like unanimously, it's like, I wish I had the courage to be who I am around the people that I care about. I wish that I had spent more time with those people in the first place. I wish that I took the trip. I wish that I talked to the girl. I wish that I blah, 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 blah. It's always experiential. And in my opinion, that speaks to the spiritual component of what's kind of going on here in reality, which is like we are not here to just fight off death. Like we are spiritual beings having a physical experience. And so the only reason you're here is to experience, is to have life experience, to learn things, to evolve the spirit that is within you. And maybe you don't buy into all that narrative, like that's fine, but even if it is just material, like you have this tight window. In the US, it's like an average age of like 75, 77, something like that. Like you don't have a ton of time. And it's fixed. Like it's not like I wonder when it's going to end kind of thing. Like you're capping out around 100 best case scenario. And where are you sitting? You know, like you and I are sitting at like a quarter of the way through. That's pretty intense. And then the first 10 years, like there wasn't a ton of us to even talk about. We were starting to self-actualize. There wasn't even awareness there. So like we've only had 10 real years to like kind of piece some stuff together. And then, you know, for me, I always judge my decisions by the concept of memento mori. Like, yes, hopefully I'll make it to 100, but that's not a promise. That's a best case scenario. Like I could, as a 24-year-old man, I'm not stronger than an SUV on the road. Like I could get absolutely floored and like that's the end of my story. Something really tragic could happen. I could be on my flight to Bali and the flight could crash. I could travel to a foreign country and get stabbed for my watch. Like I have no control over the forces of nature that are far stronger than myself. I can hope and pray that I'll get a long time here, but if I laid my head to rest in some sort of traumatic like internal thing like a stroke or a heart attack happened and like that was it, am I happy with how I spent my last day? That's a question I ask myself every morning. Like if this was my last day, is the itinerary for today how I would want to spend it? And like it's not easy because we have to balance the like, yes, there is probably going to be a future. You have to plan for the future. You can't just like dive recklessly into kind of hedonistic abandon, but within reason, I think you should be having more days that are aligned with how your last day or last few days would go than opposed to living by somebody else's script. Like waiting to me, I mean, it's like very hard to even conceptualize. And I imagine most people listening to this podcast feel somewhat similarly because they have that kind of internal sense. But like, it is absolutely absurd to me that most people wait till somebody else says it's okay to start living your life. Like you've reached the 65-year-old check mark. Go try to figure it out as fast as you can because you only got maybe a decade and a half left. Like, I don't know. It's just ass backwards. And not only like, do you not have a ton of time at that point, but all your vitality and energy is gone because you've given it away. Like you've traded your life force for a stack of cash, but you can't, you know, like slum it on an air mattress and then go climb a mountain the next day and then bounce back and then go out with your friends. Like, I don't know. When you're young, you're just like so unlimited in your ability to experience the world other than the money aspect. And I don't know. It's hard, again, hard for me at this point in my perspective. And I know there's like a youthful naivete and a lot of maybe if there's older people in the audience, they're like, must be nice. I just think that the must be nice thing is such a cope.
Sure. And you mentioned it a little bit. I do think that there is some sort of evolutionary or adaptive reason that we do that. I don't think that it's, like you mentioned, a full-on hedonistic pursuit would be a fool's errand in my opinion, because I think that that's just the opposite of side of the dichotomy, right? Like everything, in my opinion, everything operates within a dichotomy, and that's just the other extreme. And I think that there's some benefit to that. Like Jordan Peterson speaks on this a ton about sharing with yourself, meaning like delaying gratification, which I would be interested to hear your thoughts, but I would assume that you would think that some sort of delayed gratification is beneficial, right? Delaying gratification is essentially sharing with yourself in the future. And I think there's a healthy level of that. But that being said, there's also an incredibly unhealthy level of that, because you mentioned it. 85-year-old people do not, like you mentioned it as well, unanimously. Nobody has ever said, I wish that I spent more time in that LED lit cubicle working for that guy that I kind of really didn't like, that told me what to do, that made me do projects that I didn't really feel passionate about, when I was away from my family, away from my interests like fishing, hunting, whatever, fill in the blank. Nobody's ever said that. So the other thing I wanted to mention is people that are older that have the benefit or maybe the negative of so many years stacked in a certain direction. I do think that it becomes a lot more difficult for good reason when responsibilities stack up. Say you have a family, it's like for me and you right now, like you're going to Bali, like you could risk everything, lose it, whatever. For somebody that's 50 years old and has a family, has children, and children's futures to take into account, it does become much more difficult. That being said, and I don't think that's wrong. I really don't. I don't think it's a right or wrong, black and white scenario. That being said, people like yourself and hopefully people like myself with this podcast, it's finding that balance of paying dividends to your future self, but also paying yourself in the present moment, right? Because to me, that's what like gives it like purpose. Like I have no interest in waiting till I'm 65 to realize all the stuff that I've done in my life. You know what I mean? Or to give to the world what I truly wanted to give. And so if that's what you're here for as a 24-year-old man with the platform, with the knowledge, with the awareness that you have to allow a few more, 10, 20, 1,000, a million more men to get permission to say, dude, you're 24, you're 25, you're 26, you're even 30, 40, 50 years old. It doesn't matter the age. The risk does grow, in my opinion. But if you're giving them permission to burn the boats at an earlier age, then I think that's a worthy cause.
I agree. And I do think that I want to add some nuance, because I focused, at least in my previous little soapbox, that it was very externally driven, right? Like decisions you make, trips you take, experiences you go on, which is important. I think that there's a component there, but going back to be the Renaissance and taking that internal journey, finding that rebirth, on that list of regrets of the dying, the number one wasn't even the trips or the experiences you didn't take. It was actually just, I never got to be myself. I never fully, truly self-expressed or met myself or worked through the trauma and came into a confident version of myself to express. Because I think that the problem is not in the what that you are doing. It is in the who you are being. Like, who do you have? What kind of mask do you have to put on to day after day show up to something that you don't love? Like, I think that is the issue. It's a completely abandoning who you are and what you are meant to do in the world. The external is a reflection of the internal. And so that is why I will always say that there is never a too late until it's too late, until there is no time left and your silver thread has been loosed. But whether it's 55, 35, 45, 25, whatever, the second you come to the awareness and the courage to take that inward journey and figure out, who am I? What am I supposed to be doing here? What fills my cup? What brings me joy? What is my unique advantage to give the world? Like, that's what I'm talking about when I say, like, you need to, it's kind of like, what do you make your God? Like, what are you pedestalizing? Like, how much are you willing to sell yourself for? And a lot of people get tricked or trapped with the money thing because, again, risk and fear, these illusory concepts come in and say, like, well, you need to be saving for X, Y, and Z, and you have a family, so it's like all of these things, and like the responsibility is not lost on me. I want to make so much fucking money so that I can have the security to pour into the people that I love, and then also give back to the world, whether it be through the platform that I continue to build, the philanthropic work that I'll be able to do. Like, money is the energy to have the experience, but if you're just stacking it away, and this isn't even to get into whole, like, money's just a tool of the banks anyway, and you're putting it into an account that, like, they're leveraging to grow for themselves more than you are, but whatever, like, even if you're just saving, stacking, what is the point of it? What is the point of money? You have to define it. It's why the work is important. Like, in my program, there's a whole week about beliefs, and like there's an additional activity just around money, because I think that is such a massive limiting belief for people. And like our generation specifically, was raised by parents whose parents went through the Great Depression. So they had an extremely scary external stimulus that literally programmed fear into their mind, which they then demonstrated and programmed into our parents. And now we are privileged enough to have the best psychologists, therapists in the world making like 60-second short form videos and putting out tweets teaching us about what is going on in our mind with all of those things. And one phrase that I like to return to often is that fear is not from God. And you can replace God with whatever you like, source, universe, Allah, whatever. But like whatever is driving this thing forward, whatever is truth with a capital T, the good guys, if you will, or good in general, fear is the antithesis of that, is the opposite. So if you're ever making a decision out of worry or concern, or I'm afraid of what would happen if, that is not from God. That is not a decision that is an empowered decision. That is not a decision that is coming from an abundant perspective. And it is in the self-awareness to be able to observe the decisions that you're making. If you make many of your decisions day after day after day, showing up to a job you hate because you can stack the money, because you're afraid of not having it, versus the alternative, which is I'm showing up to a job I hate to save money, to then pour into something that has meaning for me, that I can build for whatever. It's really a lot of just that perspective shift. Again, it gets into kind of the metaphysical, like life is as we perceive it. So how much of our experience is literally just in our mind. But I don't want to wander too far there. Like so much of our life can be colored by the lenses that we choose to look at it with. And so choosing those lenses intentionally and making sure that we're not getting too identified with, wrapped up in just the kind of ever evolving entropy of the world that gets pushed at us. Like you have to exert some sort of like control and then choose the frame of which you view it.
Sure. And you mentioned something a few minutes back. It's, correct me if I'm misstating this, it's not what you are doing, it's who you are being. Is that correct?
Yep.
My understanding is that identity, the word identity, means repeated beingness. So in a way, what we identify is not actually, what we identify as or with is not what we are doing. It is who we are being in the moments of doing X, Y, or Z thing. And so that to say, there's no like singular box that you can put anybody in that everybody will fit in. So if there's somebody out there that's working a quote corporate job, right? A job that maybe is not allowing you to exercise the most like actualized version of yourself that you want to put out. There is, in my opinion, I think that you can not compartmentalize, but you can dissect that and say, okay, well, in the current circumstances that I'm in, if it's too much to cross the threshold of, okay, I can't leave this job. Like if there's some internal or external thing that's saying, okay, you know what, like I need this job to support my family, to support my wife, to support my children, etc. Who am I being in this job? Am I being the most creative, authentic? Am I being the warrior, the philosopher, and the artist within these parameters? That being said, I believe the ideal is for me to be able to dictate what that job is. With that being said, if somebody's in a job or a scenario that they, like Viktor Frankl, for example, going through, like obviously, if you don't know who Viktor Frankl is, he wrote A Man's Search for Meaning. He was a Holocaust survivor. Nobody will say that those were like optimal, like that's not an optimal circumstance. In fact, it's like probably the least optimal for a human being to survive. And the whole point of the book is in that moment where he was literally a number, everyone that he loved was gone, no longer existed. Everything he had worked for no longer existed. In that moment, he found meaning by who he was being in the moment, within the confines of the external environment. So to me, that's incredibly inspiring and freeing because say I make a decision that in 20 years in hindsight, I don't know if I would have made that decision if I look back. I can still answer the question, hopefully, even in those moments where the consequences of that decision were being played out, I was still being the human being that I wanted to be, or at least on the path to become that person. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
No,
That's kind of a
absolutely.
stream of consciousness.
No. I completely agree, and it's a great. It brings to mind one of the things that I make a clear distinction on in my program. There's a whole week on purpose, and purpose is a big one. It's something to bite off. Everyone's like, I want to live with purpose. What is my purpose? And I think that there's an important distinction which I make in that week, which is inner versus outer purpose. Outer purpose is the what. It's what we're talking about, right? Your outer purpose right now is building this podcast, creating content, chasing this entrepreneurial dream. But previously, your outer purpose was being the best D1 baseball player you could be. And previously before that, it was being a high school student, the star athlete, whatever. And before that, it was the elementary school kid. And then later in life, it'll be a father and then a grandfather. And so across your entire life, your outer purpose is constantly changing. Some of those changes will be intentional. Some of those changes will be the environment. And so getting away from that, like, people get identified in that. They're in this career and it's like, this is my purpose. Or they're like searching for the answer externally. They're like, what is my purpose? What is my thing? Like, where do I find my Tyro? Where do I find my Vitruvian? But your inner purpose, the who you are being, is always the same, because you're always being actualized across that entire experience. It's always the same you, the I am behind the experience. And every one of those outer purposes, the experiences, the what you were doing, is just creating who you will be and evolving the who you are being across the way. Lessons learned. A great example is like a relationship. When you go through a heartbreak, it hurts for a while because you're very identified with the experience. You're identified with the fact that you are no longer with this person. I'm no longer the boyfriend to X person. But eventually you're like, you can always look back on it and be like, well, thank God that didn't happen because of who, maybe it's whoever they turned out to be, or, you meet the next girl and you're like, well, I wouldn't have met so-and-so if I was still with her. And it becomes very clear in retrospect. And I saw life by extension is very much the same way. All of these external outer purposes that continue to change. If you take the faith and believe that everything is happening for you along the way, then it really just becomes an exercise in finding yourself. Like, who am I? Like, what is the I am that is becoming across this journey? And there's plenty of exercises to go into. I've talked about, I did an episode on purpose very early in this podcast about kind of like the Ikigai and happiness islands. Those are two really helpful exercises. I won't specifically expand on those, but there's plenty of ways to go into yourself and find maybe what are the ingredients? What are these kind of like core components? Doing a little bit of the subconscious work. The same shit that I was doing leading up to finding the Vitruvian was just exploring, like, who am I? Like, what are the component ingredients that have made me who I am to this point? Like, there's all of this, and it comes down to, like, what words have inspired me? What images do I find inspiring? What music do I like? Like, very granular and then even very abstract. But all of those things made you arrive to where you are today, and the same that the future will hold as well. So you just have to kind of take the faith-based truth that, like, everything is happening for me to continue to become someone or something. It takes a lot of the pressure away, and it makes this, like, aqueous space of, like, purpose or meaning out of the external. Like, it brings it back to you. Like, the purpose is me. Goggins says it too. Like, he said it on the Chris Williamson episode, actually. He's like, you are the purpose. There's no, like, stop looking for it.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, he was referring to, like, people train for a marathon. It's like, okay, the purpose for my training now is the marathon. He's like, no. You are the purpose that you're training. The marathon is a metric by which you're doing that. Fascinating. And I think Hormozy talks about this in that Chris Will podcast. Talks about, in hindsight, over a long enough time horizon, everything seems good if you have the perspective. And this reminds me of, I don't know if it's my favorite quote. I don't know if I want to label it that, but one of the most impactful quotes. And if anybody that's listening to this that's known me for any period of time, they know that I have used this quote many times. It's Tony Robbins, and he says, life happens for you, not to you. It is up to you to find the benefit. And I want to, something you just said kind of made me like magnify a specific part. Life happens for you. I've always perceived that as like in my favor. But something you just said, the way it kind of clicked in my mind, it's not even just in my favor. It's like for the purpose of me. Like my life is happening for the purpose of me. And that might sound selfish, but to harken back to what we've been talking about this whole time, it's like in that selfishness, you can give to the world what you truly were meant to give. So it's life happens for me. Life happens for the purpose of Zach existing in the world. That is the purpose of your life. And in that purpose and in that life is sort of like the great challenge. It's like the great journey of like, okay, well, how do I maximize it? How do I optimize it? How do I make it the best life that I'm capable of bringing forth? How do I utilize that purpose to hopefully make a better life for you and also for other people? The other thing I wanted to mention on real quick is it kind of harkens back to what we were talking about like a few points ago. And it's also in that Chris Will and Hormozy podcast, talking about choosing your regrets. So like the way that I kind of coined it in my head is from a guy I just interviewed. It actually just dropped today or yesterday, Bo Waters. He's a fascinating dude, professional Aussie Rules football player, Ironman champion, just a disciplined individual, extremely successful in pretty much everything he's tried, honestly. A remarkable dude. He talks about, I was asking him about balance, like work-life balance. How did you balance being a professional athlete, being gone from your family, being gone from your friends, etc.? He said, I never looked at it as a sacrifice. I looked at it as a choice. So we choose that. And there are sacrifices. Sacrifices essentially intentionally missing out on something. But if you focus on the sacrifice, you're actively focusing on the lives, the many variations of this life that you chose not to live. So instead, focus on the choice that you did make. For him, it was professional athletics. He didn't choose to focus on, oh no, I'm sacrificing time with XYZ, etc. I'm focusing on the choice that I made, like the active life that I'm living. So I think that's an interesting paradigm to look through. We choose, we do not sacrifice. I think that's pretty powerful.
Yeah, I agree. And it was an interesting clip. I actually kind of found a little bit of contention within myself. And I know Hormozy, like, I refer to him as a philosopher, and I think that's what's most impressive to me about him. It's not like the entrepreneurial success. Quite frankly, I think it's because of his mindset that he has seen that success. So I look at him a lot less for business advice, more so just I'm very impressed with how he views the world and like the impressive frames he has. So I know that this isn't like lost on him, but there's only so many words you can say in a podcast. But yeah, they were talking about, and Chris mentioned, like, in life you have to choose your regrets. And I would kind of disagree with that, only because it goes back to the power of words and labels. Like, you're labeling or you're acknowledging that there was a regret. But what if you just took that out of the equation? And yes, there are decisions, like you said, choices. You're just making choices. Like, in choosing one thing, you are cutting off all of the infinite possibilities that are not that one thing. Like, I'm pretty sure the word decision means to cut off. Decisiveness means to cut off in its like Latin roots. So objectively, you are cutting off the other options. But I think I don't like the frame of like choose your regrets and like choose the lesser of two evils, because it is kind of just a negative paradigm. Like, you're basically assuming that like you're going to regret something. So like, what are you choosing to regret? Instead, I think it's more like, again, like you said, almost like leaning into the focus, like have your focus be on the abundance of your decision. I have now chosen this route to go. Like I was never a big video game kid, but there's like, people might be familiar with, like, there's video games with like multiple endings, and you kind of get to based on your decisions along the game, you arrive at a certain ending. And if you had chosen differently along the way, well, life is exactly that way. And unlike the video game, you can't really like backtrack, try the different thing, and see what the next thing is. That's what the human experience is for. And if you believe in kind of this eternal karmic cycle, like, you'll be back again to get another experience. But even if you don't believe in that, you got the one shot at it. So like, you could spend your entire life lamenting or even being anxious with the presence of, wow, there's infinite possibilities. Like, how do I know what the right one is? Or what if I make the wrong one? Like if you're worried about making that wrong one the whole time, you're focusing on the lack. You're not even in the present moment because it's just the anxiety of choice and the kind of, like you said, regret of the choices you didn't make. But I mean, yeah, you like time keeps ticking. I don't know. There's just, you have to maintain that growth mindset, that forward focus, keep blinders towards the abundance that's in front of you, the next decision that you get to make. And if you choose constantly to look for meaning, how is this happening for me? Even if it's hard in the moment, a heartbreak, a loss of a loved one, physical injury, whatever it may be, like really, really traumatic shit that happens along the path, it's happening. Like the objective event has now happened to you. Choose to look at it and say, how is this happening for me? What is the lesson I'm supposed to take from this? Like if you want to be a patient person, expect to be put through things that test your patience. If you want to be a strong person, expect to face resistance so that you can become strong. If you want to be a courageous person, expect to be presented with fear. Like you can't aspire towards all these character traits and not expect the thing that creates them. So almost like, to me, I try to reframe like everything that happens. And like, if it's not how I want it, and I think that this is the way of the spiritual path. It is like the way to frame life's experiences. Like if you look at everything and it like, you can separate from the emotionality and be like, I'm pissed right now. This is not how I want it. Like that person was being short with me. I'm not where I want to be in my life. Why isn't my podcast growing faster? Why isn't blah, blah, blah? Like, okay, what am I supposed to learn? Like, what is the lesson here? Maybe it's in business, it's awesome because it's constant iterative feedback loop. Okay. Like this didn't blow up like I expected it to. How can I improve the product that I'm putting out there? How can I make my content better? How can I, whatever. But if it's more of like a life thing, like I got dumped. How could I be a better partner? How could I have shown up better in that relationship? How could I have seen that person wasn't for me earlier along the road? I don't know. Like the things are happening to you. So you only have control over how you choose to view them.
The thing that kept coming to mind when you were mentioning that, I fully agree. It really does it boils down to perspective. I mentioned Viktor Frankl already. There's many such stories. I mean, people have done some like remarkable things. Like I don't like using the word unbelievable, kind of because of the reframe that Matthew McConaughey had in his book. But to me, it is almost the literal like sense of the word unbelievable. Some of the things that human beings have done. One of them being, I'm fascinated by history of war, and specifically just like, I mean, all aspects of war. I just find it fascinating. But prisoners of war, for example, they're in Vietnam, American soldier Louis Zamperini, that was in World War II in Japan. But in Vietnam, these American soldiers were, there's some stories of several years in solitary confinement in a wooden box with eating slop, like literally eating worse than pig slop for years. And then these people come out. Louis Zamperini is a perfect example. That guy came out of years in prisoner of war. He wasn't in solitary confinement, but people come out of that and they're okay. They have good lives. They have abundance. They have joy after that. And to me, I'm sitting here at a certain time and I have some stressor. I'm like, oh my gosh, dude, I can't figure out how to do this. Or what if this happens? And I'm like, wait a second, dude. This guy literally spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp in solitary confinement, almost died because he got so malnourished. And then he came out on the other side and is a joyous and happy man that has impacted millions of people. To me, that literally is perspective. And without that perspective, I think that's the hardest part. When people wither away in those instances, it's because they lose that perspective. And I'm not sitting here on some soapbox like I know how the fuck they did that, because I don't know if it's possible for you or I to say that we would be anywhere or the other in a given circumstance. But the mere fact that there has been a human being, a man, that has gone through a circumstance as such, came out the other side, lived to be 90 whatever years old, and had a joyous, abundant, fulfilling life is immensely inspiring to me. Like to the nth degree. It like almost makes me want to tear up thinking about, because it's such a perspective magnifier. It clarifies my perspective so much in this exact moment. Like whatever the fuck I'm complaining about, dude, like it's not even remotely close. So the fact that a human being can have the wherewithal and the willpower, I don't even know what else would be. Maybe like the spiritual integrity to maintain that perspective in those circumstances lets me know that it's possible for me in this exact moment and these exact circumstances to do the same.
Absolutely. And that is one side of the spectrum, that somebody had it worse and still did better. And then the other side, which I think is often lost on the study of the greats of history, like an Alexander, like a Napoleon, like Alexander, it was like 25, 22, 23. He conquered all of like the known West. And people are like, wow, that's amazing. Like, that's an amazing story. It's very, very impressive, whatever. And then they just move on. But what they fail to acknowledge, or maybe deeply internalize, is that he was just a man, which means you are also capable of that level of greatness if you believe it. The same thing with all of the great men of history, like Steve Jobs, created like a human history altering company, technology, product, etc. And pick whoever the fuck it is, religious characters, historical figures, entrepreneurs, whatever. The people that did it and had a tremendous impact on the world. And it's why I keep coming back to Steve Jobs, but there's that like famous interview with him. He's talking about once you realize that the world was made up by people no smarter than you realize that you can change it and you can put a dent in the universe. Like that famous dent in the universe quote that everyone likes to reference. That is like scorched into my psyche and frames so much of why I have these massive and what many people say like delusional beliefs about my ability to impact the world, because people have done it. I am a person. Like, there is no separation. I don't think that I am better than them, but I think that I have the capacity to at least be the same. I have the same human genetic components. Like, I am just a man, and I have a bunch of cool advantages that they didn't have. I have the internet and all these other things. So like, I think that, yeah, like you can have both, and it's important to have both, like in the moments where it hurts a lot, in the moments where you're scared, in the moments where you're not sure if it's going to work out. Somebody had it worse and they figured it out and they made it and it's okay. That can be a reassurance. And it can also be, I'm not sure if I can reach the heights of the goals that I have for myself. Well, somebody else did it and they exceeded my goal. Like my goal of building a X, Y, and Z business, like Alexander conquered Earth. Like I don't have plans to be the leader of the known world. It's not part of my vision board, but somebody did that, which means it is within my tool set or capability, if I set my mind and intention upon that goal, that I could theoretically do that. And yeah, so I think having both the positive and the negative, but constantly returning to those reframes, like the external examples, because we're all, in my opinion, like we're all in this thing together throughout time and history. Like the human experience is somewhat ubiquitous. So take from it as much as you can, like learn the lessons of others, absorb their life stories, read the words and the syntheses of the great men and women of history so that you can incorporate those lessons and you just live 1,000 lifetimes. Like the Stoics talked about it a lot. It was Zeno, he visited the oracle, and the advice from the oracle was to speak to the dead. We do that through reading. We learn the lessons of the greatest people in history. They've distilled their life work into books. Like, don't let them just collect dust on a shelf. Have conversations. Like, bring those people onto your team. If you are in a place, you're listening to this right now, you're starting your self-development journey, you're a young person, you don't know what your direction is, all of that stuff, like, and you don't have people around you that are thinking like this, they're talking like this, like, I get it. A lot of us have been there on that part of the journey where it's very isolating. The first people that you can bring into your friend group, Alexander the Great, Napoleon, Steve Jobs, like pick somebody, pick the best of the best of the best at what you want to do. And that person is your mentor immediately. Like I talk about that in one of the latter weeks of my program is like, there's 3 classes as I kind of stratified them of mentors. There's the immortal mentors, the nuclear mentors, and the masters. And the immortal mentors are the books. They're literally the best of the best of the best that are waiting to be like learned from for like $2 for a used book or free online for a PDF. Like talk about disproportionate, like 80-20 return. I don't know. It blows my mind.
Fascinating, dude. You've mentioned several times like Alexander, Napoleon. for some reason. I'm thinking of Teddy Roosevelt just because I'm fascinated by him, but historical figures, specifically the great men of history, because Teddy Roosevelt I probably thought of because of the arena quote. But any number of those figures. Do you have any, like a handful or two or three that you feel the most drawn to?
That's a good question. I suppose in antiquity, Leonardo da Vinci for the breadth of accomplishment, like the non-siloed impact, like just like being the leader of the fine art movement, but also inventing inventions that wouldn't even see modernity until like hundreds of years later, and then discovering things about the human body and whatever. So kind of just the breadth of interest of Leonardo was always really captivating to me. I would say I liked kind of the ruthless and almost delusional self-belief of like a Napoleon or an Alexander, like the essentially believing that you are either ordained by God or that you are God. Like it is your job to become the greatest of which you're capable. I think there's a massive lesson in self-belief there, which has always been pretty inspiring. Theodore Roosevelt, a very impressive character as well. And it is interesting the more you go into the rabbit holes, and I know we've talked about kind of like schizo history and revisionist history. I do find that there is almost like a residue of cancel culture in that you start to learn that like history might not be the way that we learned it initially. And then it's like, oh, well, it turns out that Walt Disney, he was a bad guy. He was a racist and whatever. So we can't look at him as the successful entrepreneur, or even that he was like a propagandist and whatever. And all of these characters, like they were all human. So they probably had some sort of solid character flaws. But I think what's nice about history and these characters is that we can choose to take them for the emblem, for the image, for the idyllic character traits that they embodied, and discard what we don't like about them. Like they are dead and gone. They are simply pages on the shelf. So why not just take the lesson from them, even if they are just symbolic? Like maybe, for all we know, maybe they didn't walk the earth. Like it is kind of really hard to know with kind of how history has gone, like what is revisionist, what actually happened. But that maybe is like a little tangential, but I did want to like kind of address that, because I do think that like a lot of people, when they hear the like maybe fetishization or pedestalization of these great historical figures, it can kind of it can go too far. It can be like, well, dude, they also had all these other problems, but like you're missing the point, I think, if you kind of like get into the granularity of it all. And so yeah, those would be a few that come off the top of my head, but I try to not, there's not any that like are my one. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes to maybe my ego or my arrogance or my self-confidence, is that like I really do, in like the truest sense, like see myself as like peers or like parallel characters. So I'm really just trying to figure out like how I can be the best version of me. Like how could I be the next Alexander, but really not the next Alexander, like the only Zach Schenken.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you mentioned the residue of cancel culture. I think a prime example of that, my dad and I were just discussing this weekend, George Washington, for example. There's been this thing recently, however minute, that like, oh, well, George Washington had slaves. And I don't know who I should attribute this to, but it's the idea that we can't, or it's foolish rather, to judge a man of past with current like social lenses, if that makes sense. And to your point, to look at George Washington and disregard every single positive thing of him as a human because he had slaves would be foolish, in my opinion. And I think many, many people are examples of that. There's literally never been a man, a human man that's walked this earth, done X, Y, or Z great thing that has no negative thing that you could point to. So I think that that's an important distinction, to at least be aware of the cancel culture residue, because it is real, I think. And I think any man that's ever lived a good life, or woman for that matter, people will find a negative and then try to cancel out the positives of their life. And it's funny that you mentioned story or idyllic and all this stuff, how we can take them as the emblem. I literally wrote under like favorite historical characters just now, I wrote the power of story before you said that, because Jordan Peterson talks about this all the time. The power of story is real, and it's something that we can use for the exact reasons that you just mentioned. When we hear a story, when we watch a movie, this is part of why for you, I'm sure, and for many young men and young women as well, when we watch a movie where the character acts in a way that we sort of envision ourselves acting as, or like that we want to act as, we love that movie because we're like, oh, that I can like see myself in that scenario. And that's one of the cool things about film and cinema and reading as well. And to go back to one of your points about a person at this specific moment that maybe doesn't have the friends that are talking like about the things that you and I are talking about, or maybe have the friends that you have access to. These stories and these people can legitimately be your friend. They can act as your guide. They can act as your virtuous tour guide almost. Like, okay, well, what stories that do I read that I envision myself as, and I get immense joy and immense pride in how that person acted? And what stories do I read where I'm like, ooh, that's kind of I don't know about that guy. I don't know about what he did, right? So then you kind of start extrapolating, oh, wait, so when somebody does this thing, I feel really prideful and associate that with good things. When somebody does this thing, the opposite. So I think that can kind of, I'm not saying don't go connect with friends and stuff, obviously, but they can legitimately act as mentors in a way. Hence why you probably coined immortal mentors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is an interesting phenomena, the storytelling aspect of human beings. And I've said it before, but like humans we're meaning making machines. Like we will look at something that is just arbitrary and we'll be like, there's a symbol there, like it's trying to tell me whatever. And like that is powerful. It shouldn't be discounted as like some sort of schizophrenic, like you see numbers on a wall and it's whatever. Like that is powerful. Like the fact that you are constantly, whether consciously or unconsciously, seeking out meaning at all times is really incredible. And we can go back to like all of antiquity, and even the paintings, the cave art from this like quote unquote primitive man, they were telling stories too. I think that storytelling is a tool set for us to explain or navigate the internal world. And it's why it is important to consume those types of things in a breadth of historical contexts, chronological contexts, so that you can try to piece together, like you said, what is your framework? Like, what is your philosophy of self? Like, how do you see the world based on or with the tool sets that I can take from ancient Sumeria or ancient Greece or the modern West or whatever? Like anything from a YouTube vlog all the way to Plato's Republic, like all of those things and the stories within them are tool sets for you to explore the internal experience, in my opinion. And like it is not a coincidence that we continue to create pieces of fiction, but that the fiction somehow connects to us because we see ourselves or pieces of ourselves in those characters. Like there's an intentionality on the side of the artist to make the observer feel seen. It's why art is powerful, because it hits everybody slightly differently. We're all experiencing reality slightly differently, but when we see that hero, Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, like Homer in the Iliad, like whatever it may be, or Achilles in the Iliad, all of those different characters that like we can see and be like, that, like I feel seen by him. That struggle that they're going through, like me, right there, like that identity crisis, that feeling of wanting to prove yourself, that sense of inadequacy, the desire for something great, all of those components that are part of the human experience are reflected in those stories, and I think that they are extremely helpful, if not crucial, to be able to navigate our own experience. Because like in a void of those things, you can start to really feel alone. You can feel like completely isolated, and like, oh my God, I'm the only person who's ever felt this way ever. But if you can go to a text that's 2,000 years old and be like, nah, Marcus Aurelius also had to deal with these motherfuckers. Like, this is the same problem I have 2,000 years ago. And unfortunately, the Library of Alexandria was burned down 2,000 years ago, so it was kind of a hard reset on history. But it is likely that humans have been experiencing the same things for even longer than that. So we are it like brings you into the human story, and like you're not alone. We're all doing this together, and there are lessons to take from it.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And I think that Marcus Aurelius example is really good because I've never read all of Meditations, but my brother and I have spoken about it at length. He has read it. And to know that somebody who's considered one of the wisest men in the world had nth degree of power over humanity and so many human so many human experiences at his fingertips almost, to know that he struggled with similar, not the same, but similar demons, similar struggles, similar triumphs and victories and desires and all these things. It's so powerful. And kind of to go back to the prisoner of war example, it's like when you see that human beings have done what you aspire to do or are going through what you are going through, it's incredibly empowering. It reminds me of sort of a framework that I look at, and I've mentioned this as well to many friends. I don't think human experience is singular. Like we have individual experiences, but I do believe that like the collective human experience is singular in a weird way. And the way that I visualize it is we're all in the same pond on different boats. And it doesn't really matter whatever your life story actually is. The first principles of your life, the stories of your life, there's commonalities between everyone. And in that way, I believe that it's singular, meaning that there's only so many first principles that you can pull from. And then that's kind of like the puzzle of life. The puzzle of life's journey is like what parts are you pulling from? How are you utilizing them? And how are you piecing them together to create the individual human experience that is your life? So, I mean, I think that's fascinating. I want to get your take on one thing that you mentioned earlier. I can't remember the exact quote. Maybe it's to say I love you, you must first understand the I. Is that correct? Yep. And then you also mentioned the who I am, like the finding out who I am. How do you think somebody does that? And before you answer, you mentioned your self-mastery journey, like in college, you started journaling, writing, stuff like that. So basically, more succinctly put, what tools do you think people are best fit to utilize to discover who I am?
It's a great question. And it is an ongoing pursuit for myself, so I'm not going to claim that I've reached some sort of unified experience where I'm now kind of completely identified with the all and like I've dissolved into the knowing of self. But it is something that I'm constantly working on and helping other people do. So a few things that have been helpful for myself is, well, I will start by saying this, that like I think a huge problem for most people is that they are identified with either their circumstances or more often than that, their emotions. So like something happens, like there's a stimulus and then immediately emotional response. And so that they think that I am angry or I am sad or I am whatever, but there's no separation. So I think you have to be able to create that gap and start playing the observer, because you are the observer. There's a great clip, and I think it's either Bob Proctor or Alan Watts. I'm not sure, but basically I think it's Bob Proctor, and it's a TV interview, and he's saying that like we don't say that Zach is hungry or me is hungry. You say I am hungry, but who is I? You say my name is Zach or I am Zach. Who is I? Like there's something else going on here, and that speaks to more of like the spiritual collective consciousness. You're part of something bigger. But to start to learn about yourself and kind of, I think more of what you're referring to, I think a huge tool set, and it's something that I incorporate into my program, is writing. We have this, our brain is constantly going. We can't control our thoughts. Your brain is just constantly creating those thoughts. And to start to understand what those thoughts are, to slow them down enough to analyze them, writing is a great practice because it forces you to slow, still, and freeze on the page. It is now frozen that at that time you were thinking this one thing about this one thing. And so prompted exercises are great because it's like gives you a stimulus. You have to synthesize a thought, put it on the page, write it out. And then you get to look back at it and be like, that's what I thought. Interesting. I actually had no idea that I thought this way or felt this way about this thing or this person or whatever. So writing is a great tool set to start doing. And there's like a billion journaling practices out there. I would say that for someone who doesn't do anything, don't try to commit to something really aggressive like journaling every day, because at some point you'll just be recounting your day and it's just going to be more of a to-do list or like a how today went, like an itinerary. And that's not particularly helpful at learning your internal state or really who you are. So something I do, like my current practice is like a week in review where I'm not analyzing like I had this podcast, I worked with this client, I took this trip, I did this at the gym. It's more of how did I feel about how this week went? How was my mental state? Like what am I excited about going into this next week? All of those things. It's kind of like a check-in or almost like a dialogue with self. And because it's once a week, it's not too much to commit to, and there's enough to talk about, quote unquote, talk about, as if you were catching up with a friend, but it's yourself. And I put something on my story a couple of days ago about that, which is like your relationship with yourself is just like any other relationship. You have to water it and invest time and energy and attention into it like any other relationship. If you treated yourself, and you being the proverbial you, like anyone listening, or if you treated other people like you treat yourself, many people would not be friends with you anymore. You know, to be really great friends with someone, you show up consistently, you show them affirmations of themselves, you give them undivided attention, you give them space to feel seen and heard. So having practices that give you that room to spend time with yourself, like solitude is extremely important, I think, for men specifically, but generally for everyone, with no stimulus. We are like hyper stimulated. So for me, long walks with nothing, like I try to do that at least once a day. I batch them in like after I eat my meals. So that there's also like the digestive benefit and all that stuff, but just getting some time to be alone, no people, no podcast, no music, no social media, and just walk. Your brain focuses on the walking. So there's kind of like a meditative, like step component. And you'll be surprised at how much you start to really think about whatever's going on. And the point is to kind of, just like in meditation, observe the thoughts that happen, not control them, not whatever. You're just observing. You're playing that I character as the thoughts float across the screen of your mind. And I think it's in that practice you start to generally get a better sense of like who you are, a better harnessing of your intuition, if you want to call it that, connection with God, if you want to call it that. But I think a lot of those things are different words for the same experience. So I would say time in solitude, whether it's a meditative practice, a stillness practice, a quiet walk, whatever. I think the walk is like one of the lowest barrier to entry things of those options. And then some sort of writing practice where once a week, a couple times a week, as frequently as you see fit, like you're spending time writing and then observing, going back to those writings and be like, what do I think about what's going on here? Like, am I happy with my life? How did this week go? What would I have changed? And if there's enough of those things in concurrence, like every week you're like, this person pisses me off, or I'm really unsatisfied with this job, or the relationship is causing me a lot of anxiety and stress, they're indicators to make change and hopefully create a better future version.
I love that. I want to apologize too. It just started raining, so if the audio is a little bit fuzzy, that's why. I wrote down several things, man. I think those tools are all something that I have used in my life that have reaped rewards, things that I need to do better and be more consistent with. But the thing that sort of I want to touch on first is there's a quote. So Jocko Willink, I'm assuming you're familiar with Jocko Willink.
Yep. He
has this idea of detaching. And if you think about, he refers to it as a sense of from a battlefield perspective. Like he had this actual moment that he talks about in a training exercise when he was a Navy SEAL, where he realized that nobody was like actually looking up and out. Everybody was so locked in on their individual like first step that nobody had any idea what was going on. So he physically, they were in a line like securing some oil rig. So he physically took a step back, looked around, and then he was a young guy too. So it's just interesting to hear him tell the story, but he immediately tells these older SEALs, like, clear left, cover right, or something like that. It's like secure left, cover right, and everybody just goes and does it. And he had this light bulb moment. He's like, wait a second, all I had to do was figuratively and literally take a step back, detach, disassociate from the current emotion, the current circumstance that you were mentioning, and then you can see clearly. You need space to look up and out. And how that sort of ties into my next point is there's a quote, once again, I don't know who to attribute this to, but all positive change stems from the decision to either stop or start doing something. So on your comment on journaling and writing, a very, very simple journaling, it's weekly. This is why I got reminded of it. A very simple journaling protocol I learned from a mental performance coach that came to speak to us at Virginia Tech. Start, stop, continue. Every Sunday, spend 5 minutes on start, 5 minutes on stop, 5 minutes on continue. Write down the things that the next week that you want to start doing that you may or may not have been doing the week before, the week prior. Write down the things that you want to stop doing in the coming week, and then write down the things that you want to continue doing. And I think that's a great insight into what you're just talking about it gives you a clear picture of where you are. Am I happy? Okay, well, was I happy when I was doing this? No, stop. Put it in the stop section. Was I happy when I was doing this? Yes, put it in the continue section, and so on and so forth. And that gives you, at least in my experience, it's given me a clear picture of how I want to move forward into the week. And nobody ever got hurt by having some more clarity. The other thing about the walk, I totally agree with that. Digital Minimalism is a great book in terms of like solitude. I think it's basically just like a solitude textbook in a way, because like you said, we're so connected and so stimulated now. It's a damn near a chore to find some like time to be solitudinal, if that's a word, to have solitude. There's a quote, perhaps the truth depends on a walk around the lake. And it's the exact same thing. It's like you're faced with some hard decision, some hard life choice. Go for a walk. I guarantee you, like in my personal experience, I am speaking from 100% experience. It gives me more clarity. I have a decision to make. I go for a walk. I have more clarity. I might not have the answer, but I have more clarity with which to look at the issue. So I'm in alignment with everything you just said. Walk, the importance of solitude, journaling. Those things have really helped me out. The idea of detaching, specifically Jocko Willink's sort of philosophy on it. And I want to actually create an image for that, because he talks about it from like a battlefield perspective. So if you can imagine like a player in like a video game map, like is on point A, and you're looking through the first person player. So all you can see is the vision and the field of vision of the player. If you press like the map button, you can kind of zoom out, and then you see the whole map and you see where the players within it are moving. If you can imagine the battlefield as you or as me, as my life, as my experience on this earth, if I can imagine the battlefield as that, then it just gives you a clearer picture. It's given me a clearer picture, because the emotions and the circumstance that you're mentioning in the way that I envision it, that's the first person view. And you need that at times. Like those are pivotal to the human experience. Like you need those experiences. But if you only do that, another quote that I came up with last year, the man that walks with his eyes on the horizon gets bit by the snake. So if you're only looking up and out, you're going to miss the day-to-day, and then you're going to step into a pit or get bit by a snake. If you're only looking down, you're not going to know where the hell you're going. So it's that push and pull. It's that dichotomy, the operating between the lines of how do I make sure that I'm in a good direction, but then, okay, I got my point set. Let me look down. Let me take a couple steps. Let me see how I'm living. Oh, wait, don't like that. Let me look up. Oh, wait, I'm like 5 degrees off after a year. I started hanging out with people I didn't like. I started doing things I didn't want to do. Let me look, okay, reorient, and then go to work. So that's kind of a picture into how I imagine it.
I completely agree and concur. I think an important thing, I wrote a post about it a ways back, is that like life is a vector. So it has not only direction, but velocity, like the speed, or velocity is velocity is a vector. It has direction and magnitude. So you're not just moving through life at the pace that you're moving. I think there's a lot of times people worry about, oh, I'm not going fast enough towards my goals. But between the two of those variables, like the speed at which you're chasing something or the direction in which you're going, direction is way more important. And so, yeah, a very similar analogy with like the horizon line kind of thing is like if you're hiking a mountain, you need to look at the path so you don't trip, fall, whatever. But every once in a while, you need to continue to look up. Like, am I aiming at the right summit? Am I continuing to keep that goal in my mind's eye and be reminded and excited by that concept, and then return to the path? And again, yeah, you spoke upon it eloquently. Like, it's in the middle way. There is a balance in the dichotomy there.
I think it's so often, especially in like grinder culture, you hear like, put your head down, grind. And then there's a degree of truth in that, but then the people that wake up in 5-10 years and are like, oh shit, dude, I was grinding on something that I was going in the wrong direction, right? And like, it's just simply put, I was literally going in the wrong direction. I was working hard, but not towards what I ultimately wanted. And I think that's where the journaling practice that you're talking about, the walks, the solitude, the knowing who I am, what direction am I trying to go in? Not what am I doing? Because I can be doing really, really good work, really, really like grinding, put my nose down. But if I don't know who I am even working to become, then it's like, I don't want to say it's in vain, but it's almost like a bunch of steps backwards in a way. So yeah, that's a super interesting frame to look at a lot of things. I want to kind of transition into something that I guess more or less got us connected, or at least was the impetus of me reaching out, your podcast, man. So you're about 50 podcasts deep, which, as you mentioned to me, you're a 1%er, probably even higher than that at this point. So congrats on that. But what was sort of the impetus for you? What was a catalyst for you to start a podcast, specifically the one that you started?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's another one of those things that in hindsight, I am so grateful to have made the decision, because it was way more congruent and aligned than I even knew at the time. But it was part of the program that I bought into, the mastermind. It was literally just a recommendation as a very 80-20 way to start establishing a bit of authority, like as a deep thinker, as a person in your space, to kind of build out the program that I was doing, and like an 80-20 way to get to content. Because if you put out an hour podcast, you can clip it up into a bunch of short form, and that's how you start growing on social media. You know, I was going from like an account with 0 to what I was trying to build out. So that's not an easy prospect, and it was better than sitting and filming, 100 short form. What I came to quickly discover is that I had maybe an aptitude for it, or an interest in it. I was decent enough at it, not only in the host-guest relationship, but even in the solo episodes. I don't think there's a ton of people that can sit in front of a camera and like ramble on for an hour. And I have both the gift and the curse of the motor mouth, like the gift of gab, whatever you want to call it. So it was one of those things that, yeah, it was initially very kind of one-dimensional in kind of the, like you said, the impetus, like the thing to just start was just to start sharing a little bit about me, a little bit about how I view the world, a little bit about the work that I was doing and hoping to attract people to that. But it has really unfolded into this just wild world that I think has, as we talked about, kind of a massive, massive ceiling. We don't even know how big this medium can and will be. We're seeing Rogan be the first billionaire, like $1 billion podcast just off the podcast alone. And he was just at the very infancy of the medium when the first podcasts happened. So we're only about a decade, 2 decades into the medium. So it's very much in its infancy. Like traditional media is much further down the line, 50, 60 years old. So who knows what it could be? Who's going to be the first multi-billion-dollar podcast brand? What does the future of companies, investments, I don't know. It's just very exciting to think about because the ceiling is so high and limitless. And as somebody who also wants to position myself doing as many of the things that I'm happy to do for a long time horizon, kind of like a Hormozy-esque concept, like play the game that you're willing to play for the rest of your life, and there's really no way to lose. And I have found through podcasting something that fits into that criteria. I would and was already having these sorts of conversations with close friends and people I was connecting with off air, just on the phone. And I still do with people that I'm close with. I've just always been kind of like a deep thinker. I kind of resent small talk. I find it a complete waste of time. Again, with memento mori, like, we are going to die. What the fuck are we talking about the weather for? So with podcasting, I have the excuse to reach out to people I have no business talking to in the first place, business owners, people all over the world, like people I just wouldn't talk to it at all. And I can send a message and then in a couple of days get on an hour-long, 2-hour-long conversation and really share an amazing conscious conversation and then share it with the world. You and I talked about it, like the leverage that it provides, where it can provide value to us, it provides value to the person that listens to it, and it doesn't cost anyone anything to distribute and redistribute and re-listen, whether it's 100,000, 100 million people. Like, it's just really, really 80-20. It feels like a very disproportionate opportunity with tremendous upside and almost no downside. So that's a long-winded way to answer like how I got into it and kind of what excites me about continuing on.
It's remarkable to me the alignment and the similarities that I relate to in that regard. Like, in terms of starting it was kind of just my plan. I've always been the same way. I've always had deep conversations, 2-hour long calls with my buddies where it's like started off like, hey man, how's it? And then we start talking about life and whatever the hell's going on in our existence. And then mix that with my, like, not eclectic, but sort of like esoteric, broad fields of interest, like just interests that the more I dissect are actually more in alignment, but they're definitely broad in terms of surface. It's almost like an upside down pyramid. Like, there's a bunch of them, but they all kind of point towards similar or the same end. It's a way to do that. My dad, one of my favorite pieces of advice that he's ever offered me in any scenario, he's offered to me several distinct times in my life, is, what is the worst that can happen? This is one of them. He's like, Nolan, what is the worst that could happen? I actually remember journaling this. I was like, the worst that could happen is I spend a few $100s on equipment. I was going to do 21 episodes regardless. So my number at the time was, I'm going to have 21 conversations with people that I find interesting. And if at that time I don't like it, I don't see the leverage, I don't see the benefit, then I will stop. And that the literal worst that could happen right there. And when I realized that, I was like, wait a second, that's like almost a best case scenario. It's like you talk about 80-20 leverage, like that is such a high leverage opportunity from a learning perspective, from a growing an influence and a brand perspective, from providing value to people perspective. And then the other thing, because originally this is what I thought, oh, well, I'm going to have these conversations regardless. Then I realized, oh, wait, it's one step further. It is, as you mentioned, absolutely a step into many doors that would otherwise not be opened. You and I, for example, we live in the same city for a long time. I never met you. I never conversed with you and never had a discussion. The likelihood of somebody of relative higher value, like somebody that's time is worth more to the masses, or more desired by the masses, which in essence is higher value time. The likelihood of them spending 2 hours with me, or 3 hours, 2.5, 3 hours with me, or even an hour with me, having a conversation over the phone just because I asked them to, is pretty low, frankly, depending on how well I know them. I have been, I have been surprised, literally surprised, that people have responded to me, yourself included. Vance, Elrod, surprise. Couple of the people coming on recently, surprise. Melker Sfard, who's coming on Tuesday, he's dropping on Friday, surprise. Like, I hit them up with the message that I sent you, like a variation of it, and you mentioned that it's kind of similar to the one that you sent, which I find funny. But it's just an interesting thing. Like, there really isn't a medium. Like, even if I said, hey, do you want to come be on my YouTube video? They'd be like, fuck out of here, dude. Like, no. But for some reason, something about the podcast format and the medium that it is and the depth of conversation that can be a result of it, it's an instigator for these conversations that I believe, counter to my original belief, would otherwise not be happening. So it's just fascinating to me that there's that much alignment.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree.
That's awesome, dude. Do you have any like overarching lessons that you have from podcasting?
I mean, I think there's a lot for sure on the micro level that I could probably pull out, but I will parlay a piece of advice that was given to me when I was starting my journey to everyone in the audience who has soldiered on to close to 2 hours now with us, is the question, what if it could turn out better than you could imagine? Like, kind of like the flip side of the coin of what's the worst that could happen? Well, what if it could happen better than you can even imagine? What if you send a DM and Jordan Peterson says yes, or Joe Rogan says yes? What if you meet the woman of your dreams and she flies you to your city, or you get to take a trip across the world to Bali? Like, it is unbelievable what is on the other side of that first decision, that first DM, the first post on your Instagram feed, whatever the thing is for whoever's listening, like applying to a job. I mean, like, the list is limitless, but it's whatever that like thing that you're afraid of doing, the thing that maybe you're not sure, or maybe that's, that's not for me, or that's for somebody else, or, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, forget what's the worst that could happen. Like, that's damage control. What if it turns out way better than you could expect? And I think that like life rewards that optimism. The world gives to the people, like, there's a million quotes, but like, fortune favors the bold. Like, be brave, be bold. This is it. Life is not a dress rehearsal. Take fast action towards something that excites you, and you will be surprised at how amazing it can turn out.
That's phenomenal. And that's also another reframe from that worst case scenario advice. That's phenomenal. Last question, we can wrap it up. You mentioned, we're at the 2 hour mark, which is awesome in my opinion. The congruency between our message that we've talked about before in terms of the arena. Like, I mentioned that your intro to your podcast, the first time I listened to it, I was like, okay, dude, this is crazy. Like, cause that's like my memo or my mantra for Tyro is for the ones in the arena. And the question I want to ask you is, what arena are you in? Meaning, what are you fighting for? What is the battlefield that you are choosing to plant yourself in and fight in?
I would say that I want to help as many people find their gift to give the world and begin to give it as possible.
Simply put, that's awesome. And in that pursuit, I'm sure that you will find that for yourself as well.
Exactly.
Right on, man. Dude, this has been awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. Hopefully not the last time, but this has been a really, really solid conversation.
Absolutely, bro. I really appreciate you reaching out. And again, it's like, this conversation doesn't happen without that act of faith on your end. And it's amazing to be able to start to reciprocate the energy. And, I'm proud to share the arena alongside you, excited to see you grow alongside myself. And, I hope to anyone who's listened thus far that you found value in our conversation, whether it's one quote, one mental model, one reframe. And don't let it stop at just listening to this podcast. Try to take that and take some sort of external action into whatever your arena is.
Perfect, brother. And with that, I hope y'all enjoyed the conversation with Zach. 2 hours of heavy hitting stuff, important topics brought up, valuable insights, really thoughtful insights. I'm impressed by Zach's thoughtfulness, his breadth of knowledge, and his skillful articulation of his thoughts, and his ability to draw connections between things that might be difficult to see the connection in, and his ability to articulate those. And for anybody that's still listening to this, that just pushed that 2 hour mark with us, I cannot thank y'all enough. I do not take it for granted that you just invested 2 hours of your most precious resource with me and Zach in this instance. It really means the world, and the support of the podcast has been immensely gratifying. Find Zach at the Vitruvian Podcast, available on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. That's VITRUVIAN Podcast, available on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube. the Vitruvian Gentleman. That's Vitruvian Gentleman on Instagram, and his personal account, ZD Schenken. That's ZDSCHENKEN on Instagram and Twitter. Thank y'all for being a part of the Tyro Experience. Until next time, stand firm in the arena.